I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
Oxford after midnight breathes like a sleeping choir, and I have always found myself drawn to that particular hour when the city settles into its most honest self. I remember walking those streets on the night everything began, though I did not know then that beginnings often disguise themselves as endings. The punts along the Cherwell lay moored like commas in some vast, unfinished sentence, their wooden hulls darkened by mist and the accumulated weight of winter silences. Frost had begun its patient work on the college lawns, whitening the grass with that peculiar luminescence that belongs only to nights when the moon refuses diplomatic concealment. I had been sitting with Schubert and a crossword that refused to yield its secrets, the kind of evening that had become my particular specialty. 7 across taunted me with maddening simplicity. Turn back at university? 6 letters. The answer hovered just beyond reach, like a name one cannot quite recall or a face glimpsed in passing that belongs to someone once important. I folded the paper with the careful resignation of a man who has learned to postpone small defeats. The restlessness that whiskey cannot settle and music cannot entirely distract drove me into the streets. A single bicycle lamp traced its wavering constellation down Holywell Street, some late scholar navigating the cobbles with the uncertain determination of one who has forgotten why the journey began. The city wore its centuries lightly at this hour. Stone walls that had witnessed 800 years of human folly standing patient as confessors. I paused beneath the clock tower of a college I will not name, watching the mechanism prepare to announce the quarter hour. What struck me then, and lodges still in memory like a splinter, was the way it hesitated. A fraction of a second's pause that should not exist, as if the clockwork itself suffered from the same uncertainty that plagues the rest of us immortals. The interval was almost nothing, barely perceptible, yet it touched me with an irrational melancholy that I have come to recognize as the particular burden of those who notice too much. In the charity shop window off Turl Street, among the usual archaeology of abandoned lives, an ancient Bakelite tape recorder sat with its red eye blinking in mechanical persistence. The cassette inside bore a handwritten label that seemed to carry unexpected weight. Abridged. Something about that single word struck me as profoundly melancholy. The suggestion that even our most carefully preserved memories must be edited, condensed, made palatable for consumption by strangers. I found myself on Magdalen Bridge, the river moving beneath with that particular sound of winter water, neither hurried nor hesitant, simply persistent in its ancient conversation with stone and time. It was there, leaning against the parapet and watching dark current carry away the reflected lights of the city, that I thought of intelligent women I had not, telephoned and small courtesies I had never extended. The mathematics of loneliness are precise. Each unexpressed kindness compounds into larger silence. Each avoided conversation becomes another thread in the web of isolation that clever men weave around themselves with such unconscious skill. The bells of Oxford began their midnight chorus, each tower adding its voice to the ancient harmony that has marked hours for centuries beyond counting. Yet as I listened, I could not shake the feeling that one of them, somewhere among the dreaming spires, was running a fraction behind its companions. The discrepancy was subtle, perhaps imagined, but it lodged itself in my mind with the persistence of an unsolved puzzle. I walked home through streets that held their secrets close, past windows where other insomniacs wrestled with their own particular demons. The crossword lay waiting on my table like an old adversary. Turn back at university. The answer would come, as answers always do, when I was thinking of something else entirely. I poured a careful measure of whiskey and listened to the city's limited music, somewhere a clock falling behind and pretending not to care. A person can live like that for years and still be thought punctual. Morning arrived with that particular cruelty reserved for those who have spent too many hours wrestling with insomnia and unyielding crossword clues. The pale Oxford light filtered through my window as if reluctant to disturb the accumulated melancholy of the night, and I found myself contemplating the dregs of coffee that had grown cold while I pondered the persistent mystery of 7 across. Lewis appeared at my door with the punctual efficiency that has always made him invaluable, carrying a padded envelope that bore no return address, only the unsentimental pragmatism of the British postal system. He placed it on my desk with that careful neutrality he reserves for objects of uncertain provenance. "If it goes bang," he said, "I want your name on the report." I assured him that the gods of paperwork had long since lost interest in my particular brand of trouble and slid a finger beneath the brown tape. Within, nestled against synthetic padding like a confession wrapped in protective silence, lay an old cassette tape and a single sheet of typing paper. The cassette bore a handwritten label in fading ink: Lidgate Reminiscences, Abridged. The typed sheet offered only 7 words arranged with telegraphic economy. After midnight, the clock ran backward. I inserted the cassette into the ancient player that Lewis had procured from some forgotten evidence room, listening with a particular frown I reserve for Wagner's more indulgent passages and departmental briefings that promise nothing but administrative tedium. The voice that emerged carried the measured authority of academic discourse, donnish and precise, weighted with that collegiate exactness that prefers parenthesis to apology. Professor Edgar Lidgate, as we would soon learn. Speaking of St. Simeon's College with the fond melancholy of one who had spent his life among ancient stones and older ideas. He recited memories of the college's peculiar traditions, the way its tower clock behaved with the dignity of a mechanism that understood its own importance. Then came the literary flourish that lodged itself in my consciousness like a splinter, Time's wingless chariot hurrying near. I knew Marvel well enough to recognize the deliberate alteration, the way his winged chariot had been clipped of its metaphorical flight. Misquotation is never entirely innocent. It tells on a person, as the old grammarians used to say. Before the tape clicked to silence with that flat finality reserved for mechanical devices that have completed their appointed task, there was something else. A soft burr, a backward scrabble of sound as if a hand had sought to fetch a moment back and bring it to heel. The effect was subtle, almost subliminal, but it carried an unsettling suggestion of time folding in upon itself, seconds spooled backward through the mechanism of memory. Lewis returned from his morning reconnaissance with the Oxford mail tucked under his arm and the expression of a man who has discovered that coincidence had once again chosen to complicate our lives. Professor Edgar Lidgate, Fellow of St. Simeon's College and recognized authority on the history of early modern timekeeping, had been found dead at dawn beneath the college clock tower. The newspaper, with its characteristic preference for tidy explanations, suggested misadventure, a scholar's ill-timed nocturnal inspection of the mechanism he had studied for decades. I set down the cassette with the careful deliberation of one handling evidence that might yet prove explosive, and read the anonymous letter twice. Something about the arrangement of its punctuation struck me as mildly un-English. There were 2 spaces after the full stop, an American vanity, and before the comma, a hairline gap that suggested either foreign origin or deliberate disguise. The grammar thought in different rhythms, organized thoughts according to unfamiliar patterns. The morning light streaming through the station windows seemed suddenly inadequate, as if the day itself had been diminished by this conjunction of recorded voice and printed death notice. I found myself thinking of that hesitant clock from the previous evening, the fraction of a second's pause that had touched me with inexplicable melancholy. Now, with Lidgate's voice still echoing in my memory, and his death announced in newsprint, that mechanical hesitation began to acquire the weight of prophecy. St. Simeon's College reveals itself with the particular discretion of institutions that have never needed to advertise their excellence. Tucked behind iron gates off St. Giles, its mellow Cotswold stone carries centuries of accumulated wisdom and guilt in equal measure, while frost transforms the quadrangle cobbles into a manuscript written in a script only winter understands. The bell tower presides over this modest domain with mathematical dignity, its chimes possessing that peculiar arrogance of mechanisms that have never, in living memory, failed to announce the hours with absolute precision. Dr. Beatrice Vale received us in her study with the cool courtesy that one academic extends to another who has somehow mislaid his degree along the way. She possessed that particular quality of composed intelligence that makes lesser minds feel suddenly adolescent. Lucid eyes that missed nothing, a voice modulated to suggest depths held carefully in reserve. As she moved to offer tea, I noticed a gray thread clinging to her heel, dust rather than fabric, the kind that accumulates in bell chambers and forgotten tower stairs. Her handshake carried the firmness of someone accustomed to being the most capable person in any given room. She introduced her court with practiced efficiency, each name carrying its own weight of possibility. Colin Yardley, the bursar, emerged from behind a desk arranged with geometric precision that accountants mistake for personality. His pen lay parallel to his ledger, everything suggesting a mind that found comfort in right angles and balanced columns. When he spoke of college finances, his capacity for evasion revealed itself as almost artistically refined. Alice Penrith, the librarian, possessed the particular pallor of those who spend their lives in the company of books rather than people. She moved through conversations with the self-contained grace of someone who had learned to find companionship in carefully catalogued silence, her responses carrying the precision of someone accustomed to researchers who believed their obsessions uniquely important. Julian Kestrel, director of music, wore his vanity like a well-tailored waistcoat, visible to those who cared to notice, but never quite vulgar enough to warrant direct comment. His fingers, when he gestured, moved with unconscious elegance, and he spoke of the college's musical traditions with the proprietary affection of a curator discussing prized acquisitions. Imogen Pike, the doctoral student, carried herself with the particular intensity of someone who understood that her entire future balanced on committee approval and examiners' whims. Her thesis, she mentioned with studied casualness, concerned temporal measurement in medieval monasteries. Too much depended on too little, and the strain showed in how carefully she chose her words. Ernest Bligh, the porter, possessed granite solidity earned through 40 years of watching academics arrive full of theories and depart full of disappointments. He spoke in economical sentences, having learned that most questions answered themselves if one waited long enough. The college had celebrated its founder's feast the previous evening, Doctor. Vale explained, a tradition stretching back to the 14th century. At midnight, the tower clock performed its ceremonial backward run, 1 minute of harmless antiquarian whimsy that delighted benefactors and puzzled visitors. Professor Lidgate, whose expertise made him guardian of such mechanical eccentricities, had mentioned some minor fault in the escapement requiring nocturnal inspection. Each produced alibis with unstudied ease, explanations that fitted together like crossword answers in a puzzle whose overall solution remained elusive. In the porter's lodge, Bligh showed us his log with paternal pride, though I noticed 2 entries differed faintly in ink tone, as if a pen had been changed mid-thought. When I mentioned this, he said it was nothing, which in my experience usually means everything. The morning light filtering through leaded windows seemed to illuminate more questions than answers. My experience of human beings, accumulated through decades of observing the gap between public virtue and private necessity, inclined me toward skepticism. I made a mental list of names, noting small gestures that betrayed nervousness, which eyes met mine directly, and which found sudden fascination with college portraiture. The clock had run backward, they said, but for whom had time truly reversed its course? Outside, a crow worked at the frost, leaving it in scattered fragments that caught what little sunlight the Oxford morning offered. Oxford is a village if one knows where to glance, and I have learned that the most revealing conversations often take place in leather-bound ledgers rather than drawing rooms. The morning carried February's particular brand of melancholy, pale light filtering through clouds that seemed reluctant to commit to either rain or sunshine. I walked to the old parsonage hotel with the transparent pretext of lunch inquiries, the sort of social fiction that allows a policeman to examine guest registers without causing undue alarm. The foyer exhaled discretion like expensive cologne, beeswax polish, old roses, and that peculiar hush that money purchases by the hour. I inquired about a table for Thursday, something quiet near the window, the request of a man who dines alone with books for company. The receptionist, trained in the delicate art of selective blindness, produced the leather register with professional grace while I let my pen hover over a blank line, my eyes drifting to more interesting entries above. Sir Dominic Varney's signature sprawled across the page with the confidence of inherited wealth, his departure time noted as 0015. The numerals carried a faint uncertainty, a ghost of erasure beneath, as if someone had thought better of an earlier hour. I mentioned to the clerk that Sir Dominic seemed to keep late hours, and she replied with practiced neutrality that generous patrons often had pressing engagements. 3 lines above, Doctor. Beatrice Vale's name appeared in the careful script of someone accustomed to signing documents of consequence. Her arrival was marked at 21:30, though she had claimed during our morning interview to have retired early from the Founders' Feast, indisposed with one of those diplomatic maladies that academics deploy when collegial obligations become unbearable. Outside, St. Giles carried its usual traffic of delivery vans and determined cyclists, but Lewis had already gathered intelligence from more observant sources. A dark Bentley bearing the vanity plate V4RNY had been seen idling near the college gates around midnight, noted by a street sweeper whose insomnia made him an inadvertent chronicler of nocturnal activities. The car had departed with what witnesses described as unseemly haste for such an expensive vehicle. The warden's Lancia sat in the college car park with Germanic dignity, its dark paint reflecting the uncertain sky. I walked around it with the casual interest of someone admiring automotive engineering, noting the fine lime dust that clung to the wheel arches and lower panels. Oxford's streets offer many varieties of dust, but this pale green powder belonged to quarries and building sites beyond the city's ancient boundaries. When I mentioned this to Ernest Bligh, who appeared at my shoulder with porter's stealth, he muttered something about maintenance work in the tower, though his eyes suggested the explanation satisfied him no more than it did me. I copied numbers into my notebook because details matter when memory proves unreliable and alibis require verification. Registration plates, departure times, arrival stamps, the small, hard facts that anchor investigations when more dramatic theories burn themselves out. Lewis, observing my methodical documentation, remarked that I collected evidence like a philatelist collecting stamps. I told him that both hobbies required patience and an appreciation for significance that others might overlook. Back at my flat, with Schubert providing appropriate melancholy and a measure of whiskey that seemed proportionate to the day's accumulating mysteries, I returned to the crossword that had taunted me since the previous evening. Turn back at university. 6 letters. The answer, when it finally arrived, possessed that quality of inevitable rightness that makes one wonder how it could ever have seemed difficult. Rewind. To wind back, to reverse, to undo what had been done. The solution brought small satisfaction, a minor victory in a day that had offered more questions than answers. Yet as I filled in the squares with mechanical precision, I found myself thinking of larger puzzles that refused such tidy resolution. A benefactor's midnight departure requiring clerical amendment, a warden whose car bore traces of journeys unmentioned, a college clock that ran backward while its keeper lay dying beneath the tower. The crossword was complete, but the greater mystery had only begun to reveal its most disturbing complexities. The anonymous letter demanded a second reading, as most significant communications do when examined with the patience that solitude brings to difficult texts. Rain found the library windows that afternoon with quiet persistence, each drop carrying February's particular melancholy as I studied the crude typing once more. What had seemed straightforward in morning light, after midnight, the clock ran backward, revealed deeper currents when I held the paper to the pale sun and noticed the faint impression of erased words beneath. The ghostly outline of a longer sentence emerged. After midnight, the clock ran backward, and we did not. The implications of that plural pronoun settled into my consciousness like sediment in still water. We, not I, not one, but a conspiracy of involvement that transformed mechanical whimsy into something more deliberate. The typing remained stubbornly amateur, each letter struck with uneven pressure, but the deletion suggested careful consideration of what should be revealed and what must remain hidden. St. Simeon's library received me with that solicitous calm peculiar to rooms where paper has outnumbered people for centuries. The air carried the distinctive perfume of aged leather and vellum, medicinal scents that spoke of knowledge carefully preserved against time's erosion. Alice Penrith moved between the stacks with unconscious reverence, her footsteps muffled by Persian carpets that had absorbed decades of scholarly whispers. Professor Lidgate's recent donations occupied a corner table arranged with bibliographic precision. 17th-century treatises on horology lay open to pages dense with his careful annotations, revealing a mind obsessed with temporal measurement. Among them, incongruous yet somehow fitting, rested a battered copy of Haussmann, its spine cracked with affection. The book fell open naturally to loveliest of trees, the cherry now, where someone had underlined the poet's meditation on mortality and time's arithmetic. 50 springs our little room. Haussmann never failed to produce in me that precise mixture of irritation and longing that certain truths demand. More intriguing was a prize volume from the college's medieval collection. On its flyleaf, written in a hand that suggested scholarly authority, appeared a Latin epigraph, Veritas antiqua lux aeterna. The words themselves possessed modest weight, ancient truth, eternal light, but their initial letters spelled something more immediate, V-A-L-E. I mentioned this curiosity to Miss Penrith, who examined the inscription with professional detachment. Prize inscriptions would have required the warden's approval, she observed without ornament, though she could not identify the specific hand responsible. Then came the discovery that made the library's profound silence seem suddenly oppressive. Lidgate's personal diary from 1975, bound in cracked leather and secured with an elastic band, showed clear evidence of surgical editing. The page for June 15th had been removed with scalpel precision, leaving only the faintest trace of torn paper. In the hushed atmosphere that libraries cultivate, a missing page announces itself as loudly as a tolling bell. I asked about the abridged recording mentioned in Lidgate's posthumous cassette. Her response carried the economy of someone accustomed to researchers who believed their questions uniquely urgent. She had made the booking for the college archive, following the professor's written request. The actual recording session, however, would have required approval from the warden's office, as all such projects involved institutional resources and reputation. The implications of this administrative detail settled around us like the dust that accumulated on volumes too specialized for regular consultation. If Dr. Vale had approved the recording, she would have known its contents. If she had known its contents, her reaction to Lidgate's death acquired dimensions beyond collegial grief. Walking back across the quadrangle as afternoon deepened into that peculiar Oxford twilight, I found myself thinking of that torn diary page and wondering what memories from June 1975 had required such careful excision. The rain had stopped, leaving the cobbles gleaming like scattered coins, and somewhere in the distance a clock struck the hour with mechanical precision. Some secrets, I reflected, demand more violent editing than others, and the most dangerous truths often hide behind the pretense of scholarly discretion. The letter's hidden conjunction, and we did not, echoed in my mind like a confession waiting to be completed. The chapel retained winter's chill like a penitent holding grief, stone walls exhaling centuries of whispered confessions and the particular melancholy that sacred spaces accumulate after dark. Julian Kestrel stood among the choir stalls with unconscious theatrical grace, his pianist's fingers adjusting sheet music with the precision of someone who had learned to mistake competence for artistry. The afternoon light, filtered through medieval glass, cast his profile in ecclesiastical dignity, though something in his manner suggested performance rather than devotion. He possessed that mild condescension peculiar to musicians accustomed to applause, deflecting my questions about tower chimes with the patient superiority of someone obliged to discuss vulgar mechanics when he would rather expound on Monteverdi's innovations in sacred polyphony. The previous evening had featured a late rehearsal, he explained with studied casualness, though attendance had been disappointingly sparse. February's grip on Oxford dampened even dedicated choristers' commitment to musical excellence, and the last voice had departed by 11 o'clock. He claimed to have remained past midnight, savoring that particular solitude which musicians understand, the communion between performer and empty space that transforms practice into something approaching prayer. The chapel's acoustic perfection had held him, he said, along with a Palestrina motet requiring additional attention. When the tower bell struck 12, he noticed with professional irritation that it carried a semitone flat, though such mechanical imperfections lay beyond his expertise to remedy. Then came the linguistic stumble that lodged itself in my consciousness like a false note in an otherwise careful composition. After the 12, he said, there was the backward, of course. The construction set my teeth on edge with its faintly foreign cadence, as if English were a second language imperfectly mastered. Native speakers would say, after 12, or the backward run. But his phrasing carried that particular awkwardness of thoughts conceived in one tongue and expressed in another. I mentioned this curious formulation, and he laughed with forced joviality, explaining that years of continental training had left him with certain linguistic habits that occasionally surfaced under pressure. The explanation satisfied neither of us entirely, hanging in the chapel air like incense that had failed to rise properly. He offered to demonstrate the tower mechanism with suspicious enthusiasm, leading me up narrow stone steps worn smooth by centuries of feet. In the clock chamber, brass and steel components moved with mathematical precision, their purpose reduced to elegant simplicity. The control panel allowed manual engagement of the backward sequence, a switch that reversed the mechanism for exactly 60 seconds before normal operation resumed. The very simplicity troubled me. Dangerous things often disguise themselves as harmless conveniences. Descending to mundane matters, he mentioned that the BBC had recorded Evensong earlier that week for future broadcast. We weren't on air last night, he emphasized with unnecessary precision, as if live transmission might somehow have complicated the evening's events. The distinction felt rehearsed, the kind of detail that guilty people establish to deflect suspicion from more relevant facts. Ernest Bligh's Porter log revealed the towers unlocking at 23:55 and relocking at 00:20, both entries initialed with bureaucratic exactness. The timing accommodated Lidgate's supposed inspection while providing opportunity for less scholarly activities. Bligh confirmed that only he and the professor possessed tower keys, though college security had never been designed to withstand determined academics pursuing private agendas. Walking back through the quadrangle as Oxford's evening bells began their ancient dialogue, I reflected on the curious mathematics of alibis. Times could be arranged with administrative precision, mechanical sequences programmed to support convenient explanations, but voices carried their own testimony. revealing origins and intentions that careful planning could not entirely disguise. Julian Kestrel's linguistic slip echoed in my memory like that semitone flat bell he claimed to have heard, and I began to suspect that the chapel's acoustic perfection might have witnessed considerably more than solitary musical practice on the night Professor Lidgate met his death. Beneath the college tower, money arrives with its own particular gravity, bending conversations toward uncomfortable truths that polite society prefers to leave unexamined. Sir Dominic Varney received me at his Headington mansion with the expansive warmth of a man whose generosity had never been questioned, his ruddy complexion testifying to decades of good claret and better conscience. The drawing-room exhaled prosperity. Persian carpets that had never known common feet, oil paintings whose provenance required no justification, and that peculiar hush that accumulated wealth purchases, along with everything else of consequence. He confirmed with satisfaction that bordered on proprietorial pride that his foundation's pledge had celebrated Professor Lidgate's forthcoming lecture series on temporal measurement in medieval monasteries. Academic excellence deserved patronage, he declared, particularly when it enhanced the donor's reputation for cultural sophistication. Then came the detail that transformed charitable gesture into potential motive. Lidgate had recently altered his will, redirecting a collection of rare timepieces from the promised Varney Museum to St. Simeon's College instead. The professor's reasoning, Sir Dominic explained with forced magnanimity, centered on keeping the collection within Oxford's scholarly community rather than dispersing it to private exhibition. Yet beneath his diplomatic language lay disappointment sharp enough to cut glass. Munificence, I reflected, possessed limits that even the most generous souls discovered when their carefully orchestrated legacies were redirected toward competitors. Colin Yardley's office smelled of anxiety disguised as administrative efficiency. Spreadsheets arranged with the desperate precision of someone whose calculations no longer balanced as they should. He preferred not to employ words like shortfall when discussing college finances, but his ledgers spoke more honestly than their keeper. The numbers revealed their own narrative: deferred pledges, declining enrollment, maintenance costs that increased with medieval buildings' stubborn refusal to modernize gracefully. A donor's withdrawal of favor, he explained with accountant's delicacy, could transform manageable difficulties into genuine catastrophe. The Varney Foundation's support represented more than generous gesture. It constituted the difference between solvency and the kind of financial embarrassment that destroyed institutional reputations overnight. When benefactors sulked, colleges discovered how quickly academic prestige converted into worthless currency. Professor Lidgate, it emerged, had been pressing uncomfortable questions about certain irregularities in endowment management. Nothing dramatic, Yardley insisted, merely queries about investment timing and fund allocation that reflected scholarly inexperience with financial complexity. His defensive explanations carried undertones of someone who had grown weary of colleagues questioning decisions beyond their competence. On the keyboard behind his desk, I noticed the hook labeled Tower showed a clean shine where a second key had rubbed against brass more often than security protocols typically required. While officially restricted to Porter Bly and the deceased professor, college access had never been designed to frustrate determined academics. Keys could be copied, codes shared, locks defeated by anyone possessing patience and modest technical skill. As our conversation concluded, Yardley offered what he attributed to Shakespeare with the confidence of someone whose education had emphasized business over literature. "What's done cannot be undone," he declared, presumably referring to Lidgate's unfortunate accident. The misattribution lodged itself in my consciousness like a discordant note in an otherwise careful composition. The line belonged not to Shakespeare, but to Lady Macbeth in her sleepwalking scene, a context that transformed philosophical resignation into something considerably more disturbing. The woman who had urged her husband toward murder, later haunted by bloodstains that existed only in guilty imagination, speaking of deeds that could never be reversed or forgiven. That Yardley should unconsciously invoke such associations while discussing his deceased colleague struck me as profoundly revealing. Walking back through Oxford's darkening streets, I reflected on the curious mathematics of institutional survival. Colleges, like people, developed elaborate justifications for necessary compromises, and financial pressure could transform scholarly virtue into pragmatic accommodation. Yardley possessed both motive and opportunity, along with that species of desperate respectability that sometimes concealed the most dangerous intentions. The misquoted Macbeth echoed in my memory as evening settled over the ancient stones. Literature, like conscience, had ways of surfacing at inconvenient moments, revealing truths that careful people prefer to keep buried. What's done cannot be undone, unless, of course, one possessed access to a clock that ran backward and the desperation to use it. Lewis arrived with that particular satisfaction of a man who prefers facts to atmospheres, laying evidence across my desk like a card sharp revealing a winning hand. "Sir Dominic Varney," he declared with uncharacteristic confidence, "was our killer. The altered will providing motive. The Bentley observed outside the college arch. The furtive departure recorded with suspicious precision. Each detail supported the next with mathematical certainty." I envied Lewis his capacity for such clean conclusions, though experience had taught me to mistrust theories that assembled themselves too willingly. The old Parsonage Hotel received our renewed attention with its customary discretion, leather register exhaling secrets like expensive cologne. I requested details about private dining arrangements, while my eyes found more interesting entries above. Varney's departure time bore the telltale signs of clerical amendment. The original numerals showed through faintly, revealing two distinct inks. The hotel's standard gray for the initial entry, then a newer cartridge's blue for the corrected figures. Beneath the recorded 0015, ghostly traces suggested an earlier 0005. Hotel clerks, in my experience, rarely volunteer such corrections without compelling financial incentive. At Varney's North Oxford townhouse, we found the benefactor defending his reputation with that particular bluster wealthy men deploy when their word suffers unprecedented challenge. He had attended the feast as patron and friend to scholarships, he insisted, his ruddy complexion deepening toward alarming purple. Yes, he had departed late, but not to flee. Merely after concluding delicate college business in the warden's private suite, before doctor. Vale became what he diplomatically termed indisposed. The euphemism hung between us like silk drawn across something better left unexamined. For one intellectually satisfying moment, the elements clicked into place with clockwork precision. A benefactor, angered by redirected bequests and threatened financial leverage, seeking final assignation with the compromised warden. The meeting escalating beyond diplomatic boundaries, perhaps discovering Lidgate's inconvenient investigation of irregularities extending beyond mere accounting. A midnight confrontation in the tower, struggle on narrow steps, the desperate manipulation of porters' logs and backward-running clocks to provide alibis for all involved. The theory possessed that elegant completeness, distinguishing sophisticated solutions from mere speculation. I settled into evening contemplation with Verdi's Requiem and whiskey, proportionate to the day's intellectual achievement. The music's profound melancholy seemed appropriate for human frailty, disguised as institutional respectability, the way passion and greed corrupted even Oxford's most distinguished residents. The Dies Irae thundered through my speakers with apocalyptic certainty, while I allowed myself the rare pleasure of believing justice might occasionally align with poetic appropriateness. Strange's telephone call arrived like unwelcome percussion in this carefully orchestrated conclusion. Traffic cameras, he reported with bureaucratic satisfaction, had captured Varney's Bentley on Botley Road at precisely 0008, heading west toward Headington. The timestamp was unambiguous, vehicle identification certain, digital evidence possessing no imagination or capacity for romantic interpretation. The elegant solution collapsed like a crossword whose crucial letters suddenly revealed themselves as wrong. Whatever else Sir Dominic had done that evening, financial impropriety, personal indiscretion, simple vanity, he could not have been scaling college towers or engaging midnight confrontations while his car traveled Oxford's outer roads under electronic surveillance. Cameras cared nothing for theories that explained everything except the mechanical facts they recorded with impartial honesty. I poured another measure and contemplated the humbling mathematics of detection. 8 minutes past midnight placed Varney miles from any tower, any struggle, any backward-running clock. The hotel register's correction became mere embarrassment rather than evidence, the warden's indisposition returning to diplomatic illness rather than guilty complicity. Somewhere in Oxford's shadows, the real killer moved through darkness my carefully reasoned theories had failed to illuminate. The case that had seemed so satisfyingly complete revealed itself as merely prologue to more complex drama. Verdi continued his requiem, indifferent to policemen's revisions, while I crossed out neat answers in my mind and stared at the blanking white where certainty had briefly resided. Outside, a late bus breathed its diesel hymn along Cowley Road, and somewhere in the distance, a clock struck the hour with fractional hesitation, as if embarrassed by its own punctuality. Imogen Pike inhabited her graduate study like a general surveying a battlefield where victory had been snatched away by superior forces. She possessed that particular species of academic fury reserved for doctoral candidates whose carefully constructed futures have been demolished by professorial whim, surrounded by research towers that might now prove worthless monuments to wasted years. Her thesis chapter on temporal measurement in medieval monasteries had been struck by Lidgate with surgical precision. She informed me with brittle restraint, due to what he termed unfortunate overlap with his own forthcoming publication. The coincidence, she made clear, was anything but accidental. She had operated the tape recorder during Lidgate's final session, working under Alice Penrith's supervision in the archive room's antiseptic quiet. The professor had seemed particularly contemplative that afternoon, she recalled, speaking of college traditions with the weight of someone who understood their fragility. Her hands, I noticed, bore the faint graphite smudge of someone who takes notes quickly, pencil rather than ink, the mark of thoughts captured before they escape into academic ether. That evening I returned to Lidgate's recorded voice with the patience that difficult music requires, listening through headphones that transformed his donnish observations into intimate confession. Behind the measured sentences lay something else, a barely perceptible discontinuity in the audio texture, subtle as a breath caught mid-word. After his misquoted marvel about time's wingless chariot, there came the faintest burr, a soft scrabble of sound where magnetic tape had been spliced with professional competence. Something had been excised, leaving only the ghost of severed words. The theory assembled itself with seductive elegance. A cornered student discovering her academic future, destroyed by scholarly plagiarism, gaining midnight access to the tower through desperation's ingenuity, confronting her destroyer in darkness. The edited tape became her final revenge, removing whatever confession or apology Lidgate might have offered while preserving his reputation for posterity. It possessed that quality of poetic justice which appeals to minds trained in literary analysis, where symbolic appropriateness matters more than prosaic fact. Yet neatness belongs to crosswords rather than life, and something about this elegant solution troubled me with its very completeness. I found myself recalling fragments from the founder's feast, conversations half remembered through wine and ceremonial tedium. Dr. Vale's after-dinner speech had quoted the same Marvel passage, though with curious alteration. Time's wingless chariot hurrying near. Not winged, as Marvel wrote, but wingless, the same deliberate revision that had emerged from Lidgate's posthumous recording. Porter Bligh, when questioned about the evening's oratory, responded with that mixture of contempt and solicitude he reserved for academic pretensions. Dr. Vale wrote that herself, he informed me with proprietary pride. She doesn't like correction. The phrase lodged in my consciousness like a key finding its appointed lock, and somewhere in my mind an escapement clicked with mechanical certainty. The misquotation began to acquire different significance, not scholarly error or student editing, but the unconscious echo of someone who had absorbed the warden's version as authentic. Two voices, two occasions, yet the same peculiar alteration threading through both like a signature written in literary preference. The detail was minor, almost nothing, yet it ran backward through the case like film projected in reverse, suggesting connections that academic courtesy had obscured. I walked through Oxford's darkening streets with growing unease, past windows where other scholars wrestled with their particular demons. The edited tape, the torn diary page, the lime dust on expensive cars, each fact remained unchanged, but their arrangement began to suggest different patterns, implications that cut closer to institutional bone than student desperation could reach. The case was inverting itself like a garment, revealing hidden seams. What I had taken for doctoral fury might be mere distraction from truths more dangerous, more carefully concealed. In the distance, college bells marked another hour's passage with mechanical precision, while I contemplated the possibility that the most obvious suspects were simply convenient shadows cast by darker realities. The wingless chariot had begun its backward journey through time, carrying secrets that someone had killed to protect. The past possesses a peculiar elasticity, stretching and contracting according to the pressure applied by present necessity, and it was among college archives that I discovered how far back this particular case reached. The photograph lay between forgotten committee minutes and faded examination schedules, dated June 1975 in ink that had surrendered its original intensity to Time's patient editing. The senior common room had assembled for some celebration, faces arranged with that careful informality which academic institutions mistake for genuine spontaneity. Young Lidgate stood near the center, already possessing that scholarly gravity which would define his career, while Yardley appeared marginally less precise, though his accountant's soul showed through even then. Julian Kestrel sported abundant hair that decades had since redistributed with mathematical cruelty. At the photograph's edge, half concealed by shadow and a potted fern, stood a young woman whose intelligent eyes carried weight beyond her years. The caption identified her as Beatrice Ashcroft, undergraduate, though I knew her now by marriage's name and authority's harder-earned dignity. Behind them, barely visible on a yellowed notice board, fragments of college business caught my attention with physical discomfort. Among routine announcements appeared the item that transformed everything. Peter Ashcroft, student death, accidental fall from tower steps following founder's feast. Investigation concluded. The surname connection blazed through my consciousness like revelation, though revelation often arrives disguised as information that had always been present, waiting for proper attention. The missing diary page would have recorded that night's truth, but some testimonies demand more violent editing than scissors can provide. Lidgate had determined to speak plainly on his final cassette, naming truths that decades of institutional discretion had buried beneath administrative convenience. The abridgment Alice Penrith had performed was not mercy, but necessity, cutting away confession before it could contaminate carefully preserved silence. When confronted with this understanding, Penrith's professional composure cracked like ice under spring pressure. She had edited the recording at the warden's direct request, she admitted with librarian's precision, removing what Dr. Vale had described as nothing of substance, personal reminiscences serving no scholarly purpose. The euphemism hung between us like incense that had failed to rise properly. I invited Beatrice Vale to the chapel as Oxford's winter dusk settled over ancient stones with particular melancholy. The space retained its sacred silence, though I suspected it had witnessed confessions more damning than formal sacrament could accommodate. She entered with characteristic composure, footsteps echoing against stone that had absorbed centuries of human frailty. I spoke of misquotations and their unconscious revelations, of acrostics spelling names in Latin inscriptions, of lime dust clinging to expensive cars after midnight visits to bell chambers. The porter, who left nothing to whim, Kestrel's demonstration panel, the mechanical simplicity that made backward time possible for those who understood its operation. Her timeline, I explained with gentle persistence, remained impossible unless the clock had indeed run backward, not for antiquarian whimsy, but for alibis requiring temporal adjustment. She listened with academic attention, evaluating my presentation like a thesis defense. When I finished, she sat straighter, looked directly into what she perhaps recognized as a sympathetic face, and began to speak with measured precision of someone who had rehearsed this confession through decades of sleepless nights. She had gone to stop Edgar from ruining what they had already ruined, she said. Peter Ashcroft had been her brother, brilliant and fragile, who had fallen that night in 1975, not from accident, but from despair over academic failure that college authorities preferred to record as misadventure. The truth would have destroyed careers, compromised institutional reputation, complicated insurance settlements. Edgar had been there, had seen, had agreed to silence that seemed merciful then. The struggle in the tower was neither long nor dramatic. She continued with clinical detachment. He slipped or she pushed. She could not decide which version carried more truth. The backward run she had engaged for precisely 1 minute, ensuring that porters' logs and hotel registers would align with explanations requiring temporal cooperation. After midnight, she concluded with terrible quiet, we turned time back. Outside, the last light surrendered its case to February darkness. The chapel held its breath, and somewhere in the distance, a clock struck the hour with that fractional hesitation I had noticed before, as if the mechanism itself understood the weight of secrets that could make even time seem guilty. The arrest possessed that particular quietness reserved for academic scandals, conducted with the same discretion Oxford applies to failed examinations and withdrawn fellowships. Dr. Beatrice Vale accepted the formalities with scholarly precision, her signature on custody documents carrying the same careful authority she had brought to committee minutes and examination papers. The handcuffs clicked with mechanical certainty, though I noticed her glance lingering on the chapel windows where afternoon light filtered through glass that had witnessed centuries of human frailty. Alice Penrith tended her book cart with concentrated attention, not looking up when I passed through the library's medicinal quiet. Her hands moved among volumes with particular care, and I observed a faint bloom of eraser dust near the catalogue, drawer marked Diaries, 1970 to 1979. The kind of powder that lingers after pencil marks have been persuaded to reconsider their testimony. On the top shelf, Houseman had been reclassified to open lending, its borrower card conspicuously absent. Even libraries, it seemed, require their own species of editing. Colin Yardley straightened spreadsheets with renewed dedication. Columns widened and narrowed as if geometry might somehow absolve arithmetic of its uncomfortable truths. When he spoke of interim audits, his voice carried the bogus ease of someone whose vocabulary had never quite equaled his fear. On his blotter, the impression of Varney's generous signature showed through from the previous page, twice practiced before delivery, revealing that even munificence required rehearsal. Julian Kestrel rehearsed Monteverde with chastened choir, voices moving through the chapel's cold air with subdued precision. The organ, I noticed, had been tuned since our last conversation. Someone had raised a pipe, correcting that quarter-tone fault no parishioner would have detected. After the 12, there was the backward, he had said, but now his consonants clipped themselves neat as receipts. People tune what they can when larger harmonies prove beyond repair. Sir Dominic Varney retrieved what was not his with wounded dignity, removing loan agreements from the bursary safe while maintaining that patronage should not render one vulnerable to suspicion. His Bentley idled outside with expensive patience, and he offered a two-fingered salute in my direction, courtesy printed on thick paper, requiring no signature. Imogen Pike had barricaded herself behind architectural towers of books, the precarious geometry of second chances. She mentioned beginning a new chapter with the vigilant determination of someone who understood that academic survival required constant attention to shifting ground. When she asked whether the library would recover Lidgate's torn diary page, I told her that libraries never recover pages. They simply label the absence and reshelve it among their other careful omissions. Lewis discussed rugby with determined normalcy, cheerful to discover outcomes measurable by points rather than moral complexity. Strange telephone to ask whether newspapers might appreciate the phrase about backward clocks. Could I provide something the public would understand? I assured him that understanding was overrated, that most human behavior remained mysterious even to those who performed it. I walked toward the river because Oxford's evening melancholy seemed appropriate for contemplating cases that concluded without satisfaction. The towpath held winter's particular sheen, and I thought of Beatrice Vale, whose intelligence I had admired, whose emotional restraint had almost answered my own chronic isolation. Old accidents, I reflected, grew like ivy through institutional walls. Ordinary vanity and scholarly pride accumulating compound interest until they demanded payment in currency no one could afford. That small edit on Lidgate's cassette, labeled Abridged as if conscience were merely a matter of length, had attempted to contain truths that decades of silence had failed to bury. The most dangerous narratives often disguise themselves as harmless scholarship, requiring surgical precision to excise their inconvenient testimonies. At home, I poured wine that tasted of nothing and found I could not drink it. The city moved past midnight with ancient determination, carrying forward accumulated human folly disguised as progress. Somewhere, a clock hesitated, admitted doubt, then found the hour with mechanical precision. Time, which belonged to no man despite our desperate attempts at editorial control, continued its patient measurement of moments that could never be retrieved or revised. The backward-running clock had been theatrical gesture. Time itself remained stubbornly linear, indifferent to human preference for convenient revision.